So Steam Next Fest is going on right now, which if you're an indie game fan like I am, it's kind of like an early Christmas. And there's some really good hidden gems out there right now. And I wanted to talk about one that I specifically played the demo for, and that's The Last Faith. If you haven't heard about this, it's essentially a Metroidvania Souls-like hybrid, which I know isn't the first game that's ever followed this format, but this style looks almost like a Bloodborne demake, which, again, I don't think it's the first time this has ever happened, but for some reason this one really sticks out to me, and we'll get into why. Honestly, this is a really cool game that really knows the theme it wants to execute on, and it does a very good job of following through on that. Most of my concerns usually when you see a game like this where it mashes up two different genres is that they're not going to do a very good job of executing on either one, or maybe doing half of one and half of another and trying to make it into one game, and it doesn't feel very whole. But I can confidently say that at least from this demo that I played, it doesn't seem like that's going to be the case here. Of course, take it with a grain of salt because that's only 2 hours of playtime so far, but I do like what I see so far. So let's talk about what I did see. The first most obvious point that I want to touch on is the gameplay. I think that's probably the most important aspect for both of those genres. Atmosphere and story is cool, but I mean, are you really jumping into a Metroid game for the story? I mean, as a fan of the series, there's a piece of it that I like, but not really, because you could sum up the whole story of Metroid Dread in a paragraph. Again, not a criticism of that game, I love it. I even have a whole video about it. But I think I made my point, so let's jump into the gameplay aspects here. One of the things I like to see about this game is that it has very flexible playstyles, meaning that it lets people customize their loadout and build their character the way they want to, which is something that's really cool to see. Giving people a variety of way of tackling challenges they come up to is always a good thing in games, in my opinion. Especially in cases like this where it can have complexity, but it's still simple in nature. And I'll break that down. So, in your loadout, you can swap between 2 different weapons at the same time, without having to obviously go back into the menu and change them out. And you can also have 2 offhand weapons or spells. Each of the main hand weapons has their own special skill and a charge attack, and the offhand weapons use your mana bar you have or ammunition, so usually they're guns or a spell. The guns, you pick up ammo off the ground, and they're really strong, but of course you're going to have a limited resource you're using, and you're not going to pick up a ton of bullets. And the spells, they use your mana bar, so they do replenish when you rest at a bonfire, if you will, you would in a Souls game. You can also consume items or find items around the world that will regen your mana, just like you'd pick up items for, more bullets. What's cool about this too is that you can toggle between your weapons and everything in combat if you'd like to. It's a little bit difficult when I was playing on PC because swapping weapons was pressing 1, I think, and that's toggling between. 2 is swapping between your offhand weapon, and 3 was changing your item you're using, which is your healing flask or consumable items you want to use. But it wasn't as easy for me to reach up and hit those buttons mid-combat, and honestly, I usually found myself just sticking with one weapon, but I could see myself later in the game, maybe I don't know, if you're going through an area where you want a big sword for some enemies, and then you want something a little bit quicker for other enemies you're going to run into. It's nice to kind of see that coming, swap between the weapon, and use it for that scenario, then swap back, something like that. I personally found this big chain sword and thought it was super cool, so I just used it since I picked it up, and never really looked back. The game doesn't seem to punish you for doing that, so I'm just going to keep doing it. Another thing I like to see personally in Metroidvanias is having good movement. Well, again, this is simple because it's just, it kind of borrows inspiration from, other Metroidvanias like Metroid and Castlevania, and it's kind of meant to still feel like an older game. That's the kind of look and feel they're going for. So really the movement, so to speak, that I have so far in the game is basically just a dodge. But it feels fair. I mean, the iframes you have, honestly, are pretty forgiving overall, and it feels like you have a good answer to most scenarios you're going to run into. It doesn't have the same complexity as, say, something like Metroid Dread, where you had several different movement options. I mean, that game felt really good, and it felt really dedicated to letting you actually speedrun it and get through it faster. I don't really see that being exactly the case here. Not that you can't speedrun it, of course, it's just, it doesn't feel as fluid as, comparison's sake, something like Metroid Dread. One thing I do love to see, though, in almost any game that I play is when a game will let you dodge out of your attack actions or attack animations. I love that. I can see why other people won't, because it lets you kind of get a jail out of free card when you press a button when you shouldn't have. But I don't know, it just feels nice to have the agency to do something like that, especially because it's not like I'm not getting hit still. Enemies still will have quicker attacks for this, so it makes it to where I have to react a little bit faster. And especially when you want to use big weapons, it feels really like you get diminishing returns from that when you can't dodge out of your attack actions because you're really committed to a big swing or something like that. And so it feels like you're incentivized to only use smaller weapons. And to be honest, I usually like using dex-focused weapons in games like this, but I ended up really liking this big sword. And so it just felt nice that I could find ways to almost animation cancel, if you will, to like find the exact frame when my swing would come out and hit the enemy, and then I could dodge out right away and finish the animation quicker and also get myself out of harm's way. I feel like that's a really cool way to have skill expression in a game like this, so I'm all for it. Again, I can see why you'd disagree though. So another piece I want to touch on here, I think it's very important, especially knowing the other side of the genre that we haven't really talked about a ton so far, being the Souls-like genre. And that's, I mean, a genre that gets slapped on every game, it feels like lately, even if it feels like it doesn't really deserve it. I get the basic framework. Typically, it's having some form of checkpoint. When you go back to the checkpoint and rest, then enemies respawn, you have to fight through them again. And I mean, maybe like, I don't know, several years back, I would have thought that another part of the criteria would be that it'd have to be a specifically super difficult and challenging game, but there are some Souls-like games out there that might follow a lot of the other framework pieces, but aren't necessarily the most challenging game out there. I think the difficulty is moderate for most of the scenarios you're going to run through, and it's going to play very similarly to another Metroidvania you might play, something like Blasphemous or Castlevania or things like that, where it's a more melee-focused, generally, combat style, where the game would like you to kind of approach it in somewhat of a methodical approach, seeing certain enemy types and registering what their attack patterns are, and then making sure you dodge it correctly, which also kind of lends itself to the Souls-like side. I'd say this game is pretty good at managing your expectations of what you would expect with difficulty, considering both the genres that are in play here. And honestly, I think it executes, to a point of what I said earlier, pretty well on both genres. Again, my biggest concern when seeing these hybrid sort of genre games is that it's going to be something like, well, I would argue Cult of the Lamb was, where it's a roguelike mixed with a farming sim in that case, and it's not a good one on either side. It's just an okay one on both of those aspects. And I think that what I saw here so far with The Last Faith makes me confident that the game overall will be excellent at both. It has a lot here for Metroidvania fans, and it has a lot here for Souls-like fans. And honestly, those genres, I'm kind of surprised we don't have more games like this, because they kind of do work well hand in hand. I mean, generally with a lot of these games, usually you're kind of wandering aimlessly around like an open map at first, and you're trying to find out what tools you need to get to the next area. Which again, I know that's an oversimplification you could throw on most like RPGs even, but you know, usually you fight through an area and you come up to a difficult boss, so you have to use your tools that you got along that journey against that boss. Which again, I know, super oversimplification, because you could also say that Zelda games fit that category too. Which I mean leads me into the next piece, that the bosses I think are really structured a lot more towards what you would expect to see in a Souls-like, but it's not unlike some good harder difficulty Metroidvania games. Which the last boss in this demo, I really like to fight a lot. It took me a bit to figure it out and do it. Again, to temper expectations here, the whole demo took me about 2 hours with one playthrough. So it's not like I was struggling on this boss for days or anything like that. Like, it was probably a half an hour overall. But I mean, that was several attempts. The thing I like about this game is that it's pretty fast-paced, so it doesn't take a ton of your time to attempt a boss. And for the most part, on all of the combat, I felt like it was pretty fair. There is a caveat that I'll get into later though. But eventually you start to recognize the attack patterns of the boss, knowing exactly what's coming, knowing exactly where you need to be, exactly when to dodge. It just felt the same way when you're usually fighting bosses in a Souls-like game, where you kind of put those puzzle pieces together, and so you finally get the full framework to know like how to beat the boss. And I really enjoyed that. I felt very accomplished when I finally beat the boss. Now, the one thing that I thought was a little bit annoying is there's some movement things that made the boss a little bit difficult with the way the game is built out. These are minor complaints, just mind you. But there was like a specific attack where the boss will, you know, shoot out a projectile from its arm, essentially. And what you're supposed to do is duck under it. So one thing that I thought was fair and fine was if I go for a jump attack, I can't recover in time to be able to duck. But there'd be a lot of times where I might roll forward and then hold down, and it'd give me a 50-50 on if I would actually get the crouch or not, or if I'd still get hit at least once. Then on top of that, usually when you got hit once, even if you're holding down and you have this whole animation where you got hit back when you're in midair and go for this big swing, and you land on your back on the ground. And then if you hold down, you still stand up for half a second rather than crouching right away, so you just take another hit. And I don't know, it just kind of feels like, yeah, I know what I'm supposed to do here. I already got punished for it once. Why are you punishing for me a second time when, you know, my character should just be crouching after I came off the ground here? Like, why would I stand up into the tendrils that I can see? So I don't know, minor complaint there, but honestly, I can't really think of anything else that made me feel frustrated, that didn't feel like there was nothing I could do about it. And even in that case, I could do something about it. I just needed to be more careful and not go like super unga bunga when I know I need to just calm it down and kind of like, you know, wait for an attack to happen. But generally, this boss set a good bar for me, honestly, on how I'm expecting the difficulty will go for the rest of the game. If this is the first major boss Knowing that it's going to step it up from here is a really good thing to see, especially knowing that you're going to get access to more tools throughout the game. And, the bosses are obviously going to have to up the ante to make sure that, it's still challenging. But from what I saw so far, I'm really hopeful, and I think it looks really good. Now, I wanted to briefly touch on the story. And I say briefly because I really can't give you a full representation of this game so far. I mean, imagine you're playing like the first 2 hours of Elden Ring, and that's all you get. I know that's not exactly one-to-one, but I'm just thinking of the most recent FromSoft game that came out. You can't really confidently say, is the story good or not? You don't know. Like, you get a little bit of a grasp of it, and the way the storytelling is done, and it's the same way here, is, you're looking at item descriptions, or you're looking at, talking to several different NPCs and piecing things together. It's a lot of environmental storytelling on top of that. You can't really tell for sure if that's going to end up being a really cool big picture because you've only really done like, if you think of it like as putting together a puzzle, essentially, you've only got like maybe the bottom row of the edge pieces of the puzzle. I can't tell you what the rest of the picture looks like. I don't know. So that's kind of where we're at. From what I saw, I mean, it seems cool. It seems a lot like a copy of a good amount from Bloodborne and has a very heavy inspiration from it. So I think my main concern here is that it might just straight up lift a ton of that stuff and not do anything that's really original. Again, people love that game, so it's not like that's necessarily a bad thing to bring inspiration from, but you're kind of hoping for something more original here, especially when it's very on the nose. That's where I got the inspiration from. Now, I'll be honest and say that this piece is what I'm not as excited about because, I do like Souls games, but I don't love the storytelling style. I respect and think it's very cool that it's a format that can only be done in video games. I honestly love that part, but then it's kind of one of those things where, you might have a game that you love on paper, but then you try to play it and you're like, oh, I hate this. And to preface it, I don't hate it, but it's not my preferred style because it kind of feels like I am having to do all of the work to put the narrative together, or I'm going to have to go look at, a YouTube video to understand what I just experienced. Because I ruin games for myself if I try to see absolutely everything and scour the map. I usually don't finish games if I do that because I just don't have the time to play them like that anymore. I also feel like it's not very respectful of my time to expect me to do that and have to do that to just get like a semblance of the full picture. What I would prefer is just having a good mix of both. I don't need to know everything from what you've thrown at me just like through the main story and what I'm being told, but I'd like to know some. Say for instance, after I finished Elden Ring, like, what's a tarnished? I don't know. I finished the game. I don't know what a tarnished is. Things like that. I feel like I shouldn't have big glaring questions like that once I finish, this long, like 100+ hour playthrough. I should know what's going on. Again, this is kind of ranting on something else that's not exactly drawn here, but I mean, it does kind of go along with what we're seeing in this game because it does borrow inspiration and it's going for the same storytelling style. But I think that's more for a different video. I just wanted to briefly touch on that. That's one thing that I'm hoping that maybe this game can prove me wrong. Maybe I'll love it because I think that Metroidvania games are also pretty guilty of this too. But, I'm kind of unfair in my opinions on this, honestly, because usually I just forgive Metroidvanias for having the same problem. So maybe this will be a good bridge for me to start to, be a little more lenient on Soulslike and appreciate it more for what it is, on a narrative perspective specifically. But again, I think that might be an interesting video for later to go in more depth in this. But if you're really excited about this game, luckily, you don't have to wait that long. This comes out next month on November 15th. I don't know what the pricing is going to be yet, but I'm assuming it might be right around the $20 range. That's what I'm hoping for. Other games in the same genre that fit a lot of the same sort of thematic have been right around that price, things like Blasphemous. And I'm feeling like I'm going to give this one a shot. So make sure to subscribe if you want to see content in that, maybe a full review later on once I finish the game. And let me know in the comments if you're interested. Also, let me know which genre usually you like more than the other. Is it more Metroidvania or Souls-like, or have you never played either of them very much? Personally, I have a lot of nostalgia with Metroidvania, so that's the one that I have to answer with, but I've been liking Souls-like more over the last couple of years. But I just wanted to say thanks again to everybody that's watched this video, especially all the way through. Make sure to leave a like, it helps the algorithm push this to other people, and subscribe if you haven't yet. But that's going to be it for me, so I'll see you in the next video.